Great to see you again and welcome back, everyone. I'm Vladislav Novikov, and today I'm joined by Andrij Dobriansky, Director of Communication at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Andrij, really glad to have you with us again.
Thank you for having me on, and there's a lot of news to go through.
Oh yeah, it's true. So, the US just reported a surprise jump in inflation, 2.7% in June, higher than analysts expected and clearly linked to Trump's policies. Are Americans starting to feel this on the ground?
Well, definitely the price increase has been reflected on the ground. It's really the consumer price index, the sampling of prices in grocery stores across the United States, consumer goods, and we can definitely feel that these are going up, specifically based on the tariffs that target items like aluminum, steel, copper. All of these things are rising in end products. But then, of course, we import a lot of organic goods as well. Just yesterday, we had an announcement that Mexican tomatoes would be tariffed at a 50% rate. Almost all of our coffee, except for the beans in Hawaii, is grown outside of the United States. And as anybody knows, a good American, we live on our coffee. So this is definitely increasing prices and being reflected on everybody's daily budget.
But how long are Americans willing to put up with Trump's policy and keep paying for them out of their own pocket?
Right now, President Trump is still in control, still very much holds a lot of influence on his own party. This can be seen in the influence of the tariffs, the fact that the Republican Party voted almost unanimously to pass his budget, which increased the deficit by $3.8 trillion, the largest such increase in decades. We also saw just very recently the scandal about the former financier Jeffrey Epstein, and over the course of 48 hours, many of the most loudest bloggers online have all changed their mind and said that they will listen to President Trump and trust him and won't raise the issue again. So there's an enormous amount of influence being wielded by the White House right now, not just against members of Congress and the Senate, but also amongst Republican activists that is controlling the narrative and allowing President Trump, for now, to do what he wants without a lot of political blowback.
So, okay, let's talk about China. China just promised to step up support for Russia, responding to Trump's there of 100% tariff on the Moscow trading partners, including Beijing. If Putin doesn't sign a peace deal with 50 days, would you call this a strong pushback from China?
I think it's exactly what Russia needed. And we know that this isn't something much in response to what President Trump has done, but really in the phone call on July 3rd that President Trump had with President Putin, President Putin said that over the next 60 days, Russia would be increasing its attack. So the announcement by China with Lavrov speaking to his counterpart is more so the fact that Russia had a plan of attacking Ukraine even more so this summer, and China has agreed to it. And it seems as if the worst part of the announcement by President Trump wasn't the rockets and the military equipment that was promised that would be sold to Ukraine or through a European partner to Ukraine, but the fact that the tariffs have been now delayed. Lindsey Graham has been working on a Senate bill since the beginning of the year. There are 87 co-sponsors of it. And just 2 days ago, we were talking about when the first votes would be taken on that bill, possibly even this week. But also in the course of the 24 hours, President Trump has told the Senate that bill will not move forward. And we will wait 50 days until any additional pressure happens on Russia. Of course, this coincides with the 60 days that Putin promised of even more terror against Ukraine.
Welcome back to this in more detail. But right now, the Trump administration just allowed NVIDIA to sell its H20 AI chip to China. That headline almost reads like Trump, okay, selling weapons to Beijing. There is
Yeah.
no doubt China will use this tech as a strategic weapon. So what kind of gesture is this from Trump to Xi Jinping?
These are the complications of starting a strategy with Trump wants tariffs, and then people have to figure out after the fact what that means. The tariff war that began with China was not done in coordination with our allies. Trump decided to go this alone. In fact, Trump escalated tariffs against our allied countries, and then only then instituted tariffs against China. So Trump isn't helping himself with the tariffs, but then in trying to figure out how those tariffs work, we've seen numerous carve-outs. We've seen the fact that against the state sponsor of terror like Iran, the Trump administration is not sanctioning China for buying oil from Iran. So Russia is able to support the Iranian administration by buying oil from Iran. Here with the chips, another carve out, as Trump and his administration is focused on trade goods to the United States and blocking those. The dumping of Chinese equipment in the United States, as opposed to preventing, out of a need for national security, the kind of chips that you said are now being allowed to be exported into China. So it seems that it's all backward. You would focus on what you want to stop, and then you would figure out ways of doing that, whether it's tariffs, sanctions, etc. Here we have Trump announcing he wants tariffs, and then his assistants have to figure out what that means.
Trump's clearly trying to build as many allies as he can against China. I get the sense he'd love to have Putin on that list. But isn't his soft, appreciation style approach to Russia just pushing Moscow deeper into China's orbit?
Well, I think the China watchers in the Washington, D.C. would probably argue that tariffing South Korea and Japan, two of our biggest allies in the region of China, at a rate of 25%, to the extent that the prime minister of Japan announced that they need to figure out a way of being less reliant on the United States, and both South Korea, which has a free trade agreement with the United States, so there's no need for a tariff regime. Both of these countries are demonstrating the illogic, the lack of coordination against who you need to focus on, which is China. As for driving Russia into China's arms, Russia has no other future. Russia is a failed state that we are just waiting year after year until it collapses upon itself. At 21% inflation, at zero real native economy other than its arms manufacturing, we're seeing a state that is now lost 1.25 million casualties since the beginning of the full-fledged invasion. This is not a sustainable economic model. And therefore, it is all but certain either Russia falls apart or it turns to a bigger ally like China to support it. But we've seen through many negotiations of the years that any deal with Russia is bound to fail because Russia is unable to live up to any security or financial agreement it has ever signed.
Mm-hmm. The New York Times says Trump is unlikely to actually impose 100% tariff on Russia and its trading partners because that would cause massive damage to the US economy and spark a clash with China. So was his speech yesterday just a completely bluff?
Well, is it a bluff? It is certainly a delay. He is not interested in actually putting these sanctions and tariffs into practice because otherwise he could have done that immediately. And there is no preparation for these kind of tariffs. If it's 100% that President Trump wants or 500%, which the Senate bill wants. But there are a range of other options that the Senate and the House would be able to give President Trump through legislation. But unfortunately, that legislation is being blocked. So right now, he's just left with a promise of possibly in 50 days putting down these 100% secondary tariffs on allied countries who may be importing Russian goods like oil or equipment. But beyond that, I really don't see anything with teeth in this. So it could be characterized as a bluff, sure.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Lavrov earlier. So today, Lavrov said Russia has no idea what Trump meant by giving 50 days to sign a peace deal. Fair enough. It's a pretty strange. Can you help Lavrov solve it? What does Trump actually want here?
Trump wants to demonstrate that he is a peacemaker. He wants a picture of himself with other world leaders, showing that he is remembered in the history books. This is why he is going ahead with the negotiations with Rwanda and the Congo, which had been going on for 2 years and was finally signed under President Trump, and he's taking credit for that, as well as other negotiations, which frankly have not gone too far because Pakistan and India are still very much at odds with each other. It's simply that they're not firing nuclear weapons at each other at the moment. So in his mind, President Trump sees himself as a historic figure as far as changing the world economy, changing world peace for the better. However, we're only in the first 6 months of this administration. And as with any presidential administration, if you have a second term of office, it is always going to be heavily focused on foreign policy. The further a president comes away from the ability to get reelected, the less influential he is within his own Congress, within his own Senate. And so therefore, we expect President Trump, like every two-term president, Clinton, Obama, Bush, they will almost exclusively focus on foreign policy. And therefore, that's what we're seeing already in his first 60 days, trying to get international deals, trying to show that he is a statesman.
Here in Ukraine, many see this 50 days as a gift to Putin, the exact window he needs to warp up his summer offensive. So the question is Trump still Putin's best friend, showering him with present?
Well, I don't think he's his best friend. It's very clear that President Trump is personally upset at being embarrassed by President Putin. And it's been over 4 phone calls already since February and March, where the first phone calls happened between President Trump and President Putin. During none of these interactions has President Putin even hinted that he's ready for a ceasefire, which is something that President Trump promised in 24 hours. And therefore, President Trump is in a bind. What he promised to America, what he promised to the world, isn't happening because he's dealing with a dictator who cannot be pressured, who cannot be influenced. And this is what Ukrainians and Ukraine supporters have been saying for years now, which is this is an evil, and we need to defeat this evil. Otherwise, it will keep on attacking other countries.
Interesting news. The Times report that Melania Trump has become an unexpected ally of Zelensky inside the White House. So, is Melania now Zelensky's best friend?
I know the memes have been really going around since President Trump mentioned Melania in his speech with Mark Rutte yesterday. I think, I look back to Dr. Jill Biden, the former First Lady, who walked over into Ukraine, walked to that school in the Uzhhorod Rayon, which I know. And for a year after that, I would turn to congressmen and say, listen, if Dr. Jill Biden can go to Ukraine, why can't you go? Why can't you visit and see for yourself what's happening? You should be able to see, especially the west of Ukraine in the early years of the war, what was happening in Ukraine. And so I think, therefore, inviting Melania would be a wonderful choice by either the First Lady of Ukraine or others to see for herself what she knows. And she has rightfully corrected President Trump whenever he thinks that President Putin is interested in listening, that every night the attacks continue, and the attacks will only increase against hospitals. We've seen 6 hospitals attacked this year alone. We've seen children over the last 6 months. In the last 3 months, 40% more children have died in Ukraine as related to the increase of drones and glide bombs against Ukraine. These are things that we have heard that Melania has expressed to President Trump, and she should come visit and probably shame the rest of the cabinet that President Trump's cabinet seems to be afraid to visit Ukraine.
Okay, by the way, today the White House said that Trump didn't urge strike on Moscow or St. Petersburg in his call with Zelensky, despite what the Financial Times reported. Were you surprised by that article too?
For me, the surprise was that President Trump was feeling very confident after the attack on Fordo, the attack on Iran, showing himself as a decision maker and pushing Iran back to the negotiation table, which they had refused. Everybody was expecting something much more substantive at yesterday's announcement with Mark Rutte. What we instead got were promises of weapons, not immediate deliveries. An immediate delivery of the weapons that were stopped. Sure, that those weapons that were on trucks ready to go to Ukraine, those can happen immediately. But the sale of weapons will now involve a third country which now has to appropriate money within its own parliament to purchase weapons for Ukraine, and then those weapons will be transferred to that country, and then that country will transfer those weapons to Ukraine. This is more bureaucracy for weapons, so it's not streamlining anything. And of course, we haven't had any of those weapons. We haven't had any money sent to the United States for these weapons yet. So in everything, it seems to be a big delay. And we know that President Putin is adamant that he plans to attack Ukraine on a consistent rate over the next 60 days. So the sooner we work, the better it is for Ukraine and the West. But that's not where we are right now.
Mm-hmm. According to Lavrov, Trump is facing huge pressure, not just from the EU, but from Zelensky, who's pressuring the EU. So now Trump's the victim of Ukraine. Hard to follow that logic, isn't it?
Yes, but at the same time, it seemed the benefit for Ukraine is that Trump's announcement, even though it was weaker than expected, and at this point isn't preventing Putin from doing everything he wants, it seems that, as I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, President Trump still has an enormous control over his supporters and his party, and he is able to convince them that if President Trump wants to help support Ukraine, then they will not complain about supporting Ukraine as they did in the pre-campaign period. So pre-election period, we heard not just J.D. Vance, but many of these bloggers complaining about Ukraine, that Ukraine is stealing money. It seems though, if President Trump wants to do it, we won't hear the same kind of complaints, and that's a positive for Ukraine because we can hope for continued packages like this going forward.
Mm-hmm. Trump, who according to Moscow is under pressure from everyone, is now launching sanctions on the EU. The backlash could cost Europe 80 billion euros. Is this a serious trade war against America's closer partners?
Unfortunately, it is, and President Trump has been nothing but antagonistic towards the EU economy. But this is the problem with his strategy in general, which is he, even in his first term, was very much more antagonistic against our allies. And this is not understanding global politics that well, because for instance, in North America, he has seemingly ripped up the trade agreement he had with Mexico and Canada that he spent 2.5 years negotiating during his first term. This is so that he can impose greater sanctions and potentially weaken the economy of our two closest physical allies. That does not help the United States to have weaker allies. You want to have stronger allies so that they can help defend you in a potential war. Here in Europe, again, President Trump is looking to weaken Europe because he sees the rise of its dominance economically. That if they were to do what he asked them to do, which is increase their defense spending, they will become the premier arms manufacturer around the world because they have the funds to do it. So there's a dichotomy in President Trump's rhetoric, which is he wants something to happen one way, but in the end, the after effects will be negative for the United States. I don't know what the best strategy to counter that is, because it seems that explaining things to him doesn't seem to work. He needs to possibly hear it from other world leaders themselves, as we saw when they brought up Ukraine and how important it was for them to support Ukraine during this period.
Mm-hmm. But Trump wants Europe to spend more on Ukraine, yet he's slapping them with sanctions. How does that make any sense?
It does not. There's no other long-winded explanation. It does not. It's the same thing when we discuss China and the fact that you are slapping South Korea and Japan with 25% sanctions when you want them to help contain China. This is not going to help them. This is not going to increase their defense spending, and it'll only be more expensive for the United States in the end.
By the way, some say sanctions have become a kind of modern weapon, right? Alongside missile and ammo. These days, global conflict are often handled with economic pressure, not just military force. Do you think that actually works?
It works when it's done in concert. The problem is for many sanctions regimes, and sometimes they just remain sanctions regime. You can point out the fact that Cuba has been sanctioned for over half a century and still hasn't changed their mind. It's because that's the only thing that has remained against Cuba is a sanction regime. If you want to have a government change direction, then you need to have a whole range of pressure on them. This is what activists in the United States have been calling for against Russia, not just sanctions. But first of all, you need to update the sanctions every year because Russia has changed so many of these black market oil dealers, so Russian firms who are passing along money. They change every year. So that's why we've had 17 and now 18 European packages of sanctions, but the United States has still to update it in 2025. So you need to have sanctions. You need to have additional military pressure, like the buildup of not just Ukraine's military, but additional military installations within the Baltics and Poland, all across the Russian border. In fact, they should have carriers up at the Arctic Sea surrounding Russia, which Russia always says it's surrounded. We have never surrounded Russia. I think the NATO alliance has the resources to do it, but we've never brought that to bear. So there needs to be not just sanctions, but sanctions need to be put together with other instruments.
Yeah, but are we seeing an evolution in how sanction work? Some say it's starting to look more like anti-corruption law, where it's not longer enough to just check a list of banned companies. Now you have to dig deeper, trace where their goods go, and ask, could this end up in a Russian missile?
Yeah, well, I think this is why we've seen 17 and 18 packages from Europe. It's not the fact that they are expanding sanctions so much as they are identifying new companies that have been incorporated or possibly just switched over from the previous companies that were working against international sanctions. Sanctions are by their own validity, they're pretty specific. You have to name a country, a city, a specific business that is doing work that you want to sanction. And in this respect, you need to update that list every year, hopefully more often if possible. This is something that the United States has not done against Russia, and which is why Russia is able to get away with a lot more manipulation than they are against Europe right now, which again just recently updated to its 18 package of sanctions, and I might add is working towards a price cap on oil.
Andrij, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and insight. Great having you with us.
Thank you so much, and please invite me back for more news.
Yes.